There are moments in life that do not begin with shouting. No tears hit the floor, no doors are slammed shut in anger. They begin with a very short sound. The sharp, brittle crack of a porcelain plate shattering against marble. The sound echoed through a luxury restaurant in the heart of Manhattan, a place where everything is designed to be silent. Silence so that money can be respected. Silence so power is never questioned. And because of that, when the plate shattered, the entire room froze. Unacceptable. Eleanor Whitmore's voice, 62 years old, cut through the air like a blade. No need to raise it, no need to scream. It was cold enough to make others feel small. You call this service? My dog eats off a cleaner plate than this pile of garbage. Those words were not aimed only at the shattered dish. They were directed straight at the young woman standing before her. Her name was Emily Carter, 24 years old, and this was only her third day on the job at this restaurant. Emily stood frozen, both hands gripping the now empty tray. She didn't know whether she should bend down to pick up the broken pieces or apologize first. In truth, she had already apologized, but her apology seemed to carry no value in this room. Eleanor Whitmore stood up. The cream-colored Chanel suit hugged her slender frame, a pearl necklace glinting beneath the soft golden lights. Everything about her, from the Italian leather shoes to the expensive handbag resting casually beside her chair, said one thing. She was accustomed to being served, not questioned. You think I'll let those filthy hands touch my food again? Eleanor's gaze swept from Emily's wrists down her uniform, stopping at the worn heels of her shoes. Look at you, she continued, her voice dripping with contempt. You smell like the bus, like poverty, like desperation. Some diners lowered their heads, others turned their chairs away entirely, and at a few tables, phones were quietly raised. Emily felt the heat rush up her neck, not from shame, but from something choking inside her. Yes, she took the bus every morning from Queens. Yes, she wore a reused uniform because she hadn't had time to buy a new one. But none of them knew that just hours earlier, Emily had left home before dawn. No one knew she had woken up at 5 a.m. to check her sister's oxygen tank before locking the door. No one knew that every dollar she earned had a purpose, not for luxury, but for survival. Ma'am? Emily spoke, struggling to keep her voice steady. I'm very sorry. I will. You won't do anything, Eleanor interrupted her. You're new. I can tell. She laughed, a short, dry sound. Is this who they hire now? Girls this mediocre are allowed to stand here? The restaurant manager appeared, sweat beading across his forehead. He tried to calm her, tried to guide Eleanor back to her seat, but it was too late. Emily could feel 20 pairs of eyes fixed on her back. She stood there, suspended between other people's luxury and her own silence. And somewhere deep inside her, a question began to form. A question Emily had avoided for many years. If she kept lowering her head, how long would it take before others stopped stepping on her? Emily didn't know that in just a few minutes the restaurant doors would open and a man would walk in. A man who could change everything. But in this moment, all she had was her dignity. And it was being weighed. No one in the restaurant said another word. But that very silence was heavier than any insult. Emily stood there, in a room adorned with expensive paintings and wine glasses that cost as much as an entire week of her wages, feeling one thing with painful clarity. Everyone was watching, but no one was on her side. Some diners lowered their heads, pretending to study the menu. Others suddenly became busy with their phones. And there were looks, curious, cold, as if this were nothing more than an interesting performance during their lunch. Eleanor Whitmore crossed her arms over her chest, standing tall like a judge ready to deliver a sentence. "Do you know who I am?" she asked, her voice frighteningly gentle. Emily swallowed hard. She knew. Everyone in this room knew. Eleanor Whitmore, a name that appeared at fundraising galas, charity banquets, and society pages in glossy magazines. A woman who could make a single phone call and force this entire restaurant to bow in apology. "Ma'am, No," Eleanor interrupted. "You don't just anything." She stepped closer, narrowing the space between them. No pushing, no touching. Just close enough for Emily to smell the expensive perfume, a scent not meant to be pleasant but to assert dominance. "Do you think you deserve to stand here? Do you think you belong in a place like this?" Emily felt her throat go dry. She wanted to say she was just doing her job. She wanted to say she was trying. She wanted to say that everyone has to start somewhere. But every time she opened her mouth, Eleanor cut her off, as if refusing to allow another voice to exist. "Look at you," Eleanor continued, her eyes making no effort to hide their contempt. "You look like you just stepped off a bus terminal." A soft laugh came from somewhere in the restaurant, not loud, not clear, but enough for Emily to hear, and enough to make something inside her tremble. The restaurant manager stood nearby, his hands clasped together. He wanted to intervene. Emily could see it in his eyes. But he did nothing. Because sometimes the fear of offending someone powerful outweighs the desire to protect someone vulnerable. Emily suddenly realized a bitter truth. In this place, silence was considered politeness, but in reality, it was complicity. "You've ruined my lunch," Eleanor said, her voice icy. "And I have no obligation to tolerate the carelessness of people like you." People like you. The phrase hung in the air, heavy as lead. Emily thought of the small apartment in Queens, of the worn dining table where she and Lily sat across from each other every night, of the steady hum of the breathing machine in the dark, reminding her that time was not on their side. She was used to enduring, used to swallow her words, used to tell herself just a little longer. But now, under the warm golden lights and those indifferent stares, Emily understood something more terrifying than being fired. If she kept staying silent, if she continued to let others define her worth, then it wouldn't just be this job that disappeared. It would be her, piece by piece. Eleanor turned to the manager. "I don't want to see her here anymore." The words were spoken lightly, as if it were an obvious decision. "Fire her. Right now." The air in the restaurant froze. Some people held their breath. Others stole glances at Emily, as if waiting to see whether she would collapse or beg. Emily felt her heart pounding so hard her ears rang. She knew what this meant. Losing her job, losing her income, losing one of the fragile threads keeping her life from falling apart. She looked down at her worn shoes, then she looked back at Eleanor. And in that moment, Emily understood. There are times when the cost of silence is far greater than the cost of speaking up. She took a deep breath. For the first time since stepping into this restaurant, Emily lifted her head. And when she opened her mouth, nothing would ever be the same again. Emily took a deep breath. Not the kind of breath meant to calm herself, but the kind taken by someone who has made a decision. She no longer looked down at the marble floor. She no longer looked at the shattered porcelain, the thing that just minutes earlier had filled her with fear. Emily lifted her head. Her eyes met Eleanor Whitmore's directly. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath at the same time. No one expected the young waitress to say anything more. They were waiting for another apology or a weak plea, but Emily did neither. "You're right," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, it didn't shake, and it wasn't angry. That was what made it unsettling. "I take the bus every day." A few eyes flickered with surprise. Eleanor raised an eyebrow as if waiting for the following line so she could continue her contempt. "I take 2 buses from Queens to be here at 6 in the morning," Emily continued. "Not because I'm lazy, but because I need this job." She paused for a beat, not to catch her breath, but to let everyone hear. "My uniform isn't new," she said, "because that money goes toward my college tuition." Several people in the restaurant shifted slightly in their seats. The earlier comfort began to crack. "And these shoes?" Emily glanced down at her worn heels, then looked back up. "They're worn out because I walk a lot. To work, to school, and to the hospital." The air grew thick. "My sister is 17, she continued, her voice lower now. "She has cystic fibrosis. Every day, I work to make sure she still has a tomorrow." Eleanor opened her mouth as if to speak, but this time, Emily didn't stop. "You called me dirty," she said, "but I bathe every day. I wash my uniform every night. I do my job honestly." Emily tilted her head just slightly. "Do you know what truly smells?" The question hung in the room. "Cruelty," Emily said slowly. "Loneliness disguised as power. The need to diminish others in order to feel important." A fork slipped from someone's hand. The sharp clink of metal echoed in the absolute silence. Emily was no longer speaking to Eleanor alone. She was speaking to everyone. "I don't belong to your world," she said, "but that doesn't make me worth any less. I'm here to work, not to be humiliated." Eleanor stood rigid. The color drained from her face, then rushed back. "You dare," Eleanor snarled. "No," Emily interrupted, and this time no one in the restaurant saw it as rude. "I dare to respect myself." A tiny but irreversible shift rippled through the room. A woman at a nearby table lowered her phone. A young man crossed his arms, his gaze no longer indifferent. The restaurant manager straightened his back just a little. Eleanor took half a step backwards. No one applauded. No one cheered. But in that moment, the old order collapsed. Eleanor spun toward the manager. "Get her out! Now!" Her voice was sharper, more rushed, no longer absolute. Emily heard every word. She knew what could come next. Termination, losing her job, losing her only source of income. But strangely, she wasn't afraid anymore. Because for the first time in many years, Emily felt herself standing upright. And sometimes, the most terrifying thing isn't losing everything. It's living an entire life without ever defending your dignity. Emily placed the tray down on the table very gently. "You can fire me," she said, "but you can't take away who I am." The restaurant fell into silence. And then, the front door began to open. A rush of cold air swept inside. A man stepped in, and Emily had no idea that in just a few seconds, everything was about to change in a way no one could have imagined. The restaurant's glass doors opened with a sharp click. A rush of cold air poured in, carrying the scent of Manhattan streets. car exhaust, winter wind, and the urgency of a city that never stops. But what made everyone turn their heads wasn't the cold. It was the man who had just walked in. He looked to be about 38, tall, upright posture, a gray suit tailored so precisely that it radiated absolute confidence without needing to show off. He paused for a brief moment at the doorway, his eyes sweeping quickly across the room. The broken porcelain scattered across the floor, the phones still half raised in people's hands, and finally, stopping on Emily. Then he spoke. "Mom." Just one word. Not loud, not sharp, but enough to freeze the entire room. What the hell is going on here? Eleanor Whitmore spun around. Her expression shifted instantly as if someone had flipped a switch. "Daniel, darling," she said quickly, her voice sweet to the point of being artificial. "You arrived just in time. I'm dealing with a situation involving an incompetent employee." Daniel Whitmore. The name spread through the room faster than any whisper. A few diners' eyes widened, others lowered their phones completely. The CEO of Whitmore Technologies. The youngest tech billionaire in the United States, the man who appeared on the cover of Forbes more often than on his own social media. Emily recognized him immediately, not because of the wealth, but because of the look in his eyes right now, cold and focused, as if he were struggling to keep himself from getting angry. "I was standing outside by the car," Daniel continued, stepping slowly inside. "I was on a call when I heard shouting." He looked down at the shattered plate on the floor. "And I heard everything," he said, "for the past 5 minutes." The color drained from Eleanor's face. "You don't understand," she said quickly. "She was careless. Ruined my lunch. Extremely rude." Daniel lifted his head, his gaze sharpened. "You threw the plate on the floor," he said. "I saw it through the glass." He turned to Emily. "And then," he continued, his voice dropping lower, "you stood here and insulted her over her financial situation." No one spoke. No one dared to move. Daniel took a deep breath. "While this entire restaurant was recording." Emily blinked. "Recording?" She turned her head and looked around, and that was when she realized. At least 3 or 4 phones were still pointed directly at them. Eleanor shook her head. "You're exaggerating. I never—" "That's enough," Daniel cut in. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't emphasize the words. It was simply a matter of drawing a boundary. He turned to the manager. "How much did the plate cost?" $320, the manager replied, his voice trembling. Daniel opened his wallet, pulled out 4 $100 bills, placed them on the table. "$320 for the plate," he said. "The rest," he turned to Emily, looked at the name tag on her chest, "is for Emily." Emily's eyes widened. That amount was nearly a week's worth of her wages. "Sir, I can't accept this," she stammered. "Please accept it," Daniel said, his tone noticeably softer when speaking to her. "As an apology for the unacceptable behavior you were just subjected to." Eleanor stood frozen. "Daniel Sebastian Whitmore," she hissed through clenched teeth. "Step outside with me. Right now." Daniel looked back at his mother. There was no anger in his eyes, only disappointment. "No, Mom," he said slowly. "We've had enough private conversations." He turned to Emily, then looked back at the room. "There are conversations," he said, "that need to happen. In front of everyone." The restaurant fell into silence. And for the first time since this story began, Eleanor Whitmore, the woman accustomed to making others bow their heads, felt herself being backed into a corner. The air in the restaurant was so heavy it felt almost tangible. Eleanor Whitmore stood there, her back straight, chin slightly raised, the familiar posture of someone who had never had to apologize to anyone. But this time, she wasn't facing an employee she could fire, nor a manager she could pressure. She was facing her son. "Daniel," Eleanor said slowly, trying to keep her voice composed, "you're embarrassing me in front of all these people." Daniel didn't avoid her gaze. "You did that yourself," he replied. "I'm just making sure it doesn't get ignored like it always does." A soft ripple of murmurs spread through the room. No one spoke loudly, but everyone was listening. Eleanor drew in a deep breath. She turned to Emily, for the first time looking at her directly, not from above. You were rude," Eleanor said. "You ruined my lunch." Daniel crossed his arms. "Mom," he said, his voice frighteningly calm. "Start over." Eleanor froze. "What do you want me to do?" she asked. Daniel looked her straight in the eyes. "Apologize." One word, light, but heavy enough to throw Eleanor's entire world off balance. "Are you serious?" Eleanor let out a dry laugh. "Over a waitress?" "No," Daniel answered immediately. "Over a human being." The room fell silent once again. Eleanor looked around. The stairs, the phones, the faces that no longer held the same reverence as before. For the first time, she realized something terrifying. Her power was no longer absolute. "Are you threatening me?" Eleanor hissed. Daniel shook his head. "I'm setting consequences," he said. "Either you apologize to her, right now, or I make sure that every charity, every social club, every business partner you value knows exactly how you treat people when no important guests are around." Eleanor went pale. She turned back to Emily. Emily stood still. She didn't provoke, she didn't beg. She simply stood there, calm in a way that felt almost unreal. Seconds passed, stretching like hours. Finally, Eleanor spoke. "I'm sorry." The words came out quickly, clipped, as if she wanted to end this as fast as possible. Daniel didn't move. "No," he said. "That's not an apology. That's avoidance." Eleanor tightened her grip on her handbag. Her knuckles turned white. She swallowed. "I apologize," Eleanor said again, "for the way I spoke to you. That was inappropriate." No one clapped. No one smiled. It was a hollow apology, but technically, it existed. Daniel let out a long breath, clearly dissatisfied, yet understanding that this was likely the limit of his mother's capacity at this moment. Then he turned to Emily. "Do you accept her apology?" The question dropped like a stone. All eyes immediately shifted to Emily. This was her moment. She could refuse. She could say it wasn't enough. She could make Eleanor Whitmore taste the very humiliation she had inflicted, and no one in this room would blame her. Emily felt her heart pounding. She thought of Lily, of the stark white hospital room, of the stack of medical bills on the kitchen table, of this job, not perfect, but necessary. She also thought of herself, of the person she wanted to be. Emily lifted her head. "Yes," she said softly. "I accept your apology, Mrs. Whitmore." Not because Eleanor deserved it, but because Emily deserved peace. Eleanor said nothing more. She turned, grabbed her expensive handbag, and walked quickly toward the door. She tried to keep her head high, but everyone could see. Her shoulders were stiff, her steps hurried, and the glass door closed behind her with a very soft click, echoing like the aftersound of a fall that made no noise. Daniel stood still for a moment, watching the direction his mother had gone. Then he turned back, and for the first time since stepping into the restaurant, his eyes softened. After Eleanor Whitmore left the restaurant, the air slowly began to move again. Spoons lightly touched plates. Whispered conversations resumed, slowly, cautiously, as if everyone had just witnessed something they weren't quite ready to name. Daniel remained standing there, silent, his gaze fixed on the glass door where his mother had disappeared. There was no sense of victory, no satisfaction, only a very real exhaustion. He turned to Emily. "Are you okay?" Daniel asked. A simple question, not polite small talk. There was something in his eyes that made Emily realize he truly wanted to know the answer. Emily nodded, then shook her head. She wasn't sure how okay she really was. Thank you," she said. "You didn't have to do all of that." Daniel shook his head gently. "I did," he said. "Not for you. For myself." Emily looked up at him, surprised. Daniel turned to the manager and spoke briefly about the shift, emphasizing that there would be no consequences for Emily whatsoever. His voice was calm, but it left no room for argument. When things had settled, he turned back to her. "Could we talk privately for a moment?" Daniel asked. "Just a few minutes." Emily's heart sank. She didn't know what to expect. An offer to keep quiet? Money to forget what had just happened? But she nodded. They walked toward the large window overlooking Central Park. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the glass, casting long bands of light across the floor. Daniel slipped his hands into his pockets and stood still for a moment before speaking. "You mentioned your sister," he said. "You said she's ill." Emily paused. She hadn't expected him to remember that. "Yes," she replied softly. "Her name is Lily. She's 17. Daniel turned to look at her. "Can you tell me more?" Emily hesitated, not because she didn't want to speak, but because she was used to no one truly listening. "Lily has cystic fibrosis," she said after a moment. "There's a new medication, Trikafta. The doctors say it could help her live a nearly normal life." Her voice caught. "But the cost, it's too high." Daniel didn't interrupt. He didn't overreact. He simply listened. "I work 3 jobs," Emily continued. "Here during the day, college classes at night, a cafe on weekends. But it feels like I'm trying to scoop out the ocean with a spoon." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. He took out his phone. "What's your full name?" he asked. "Emily Carter." "The hospital?" "Mount Sinai." Emily quickly shook her head. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm not asking—" "I know," Daniel said gently. "That's exactly why I want to help." He looked up, his expression serious. "You stood your ground in front of my mother," he said, "even though you knew it could cost you everything." "Not many people can do that." Emily felt her eyes burn. Daniel put his phone away. "My father used to be a waiter," he said, his voice lowering. "He always told me, money is just paper, if you don't use it to make the world a little less cruel." He looked directly at Emily. "You reminded me why I started my foundation." Emily shook her head repeatedly. "I can't accept this," she said. "It's too much." Daniel smiled faintly. Sometimes, he said, the hardest thing isn't giving. It's allowing others to help. He rested his hand on the window ledge. I'll make a few calls, he said. You'll hear from the hospital within 48 hours. Emily didn't know what to say. Tears spilt over before she could stop them. Thank you, she whispered. Daniel turned away before she could say anything else. No, he said, his voice low but warm. Thank you for reminding me that this world still has people who choose to do the right thing, even when it costs them something. Emily remained by the window long after Daniel left. Outside, Manhattan was still loud and relentless, but inside her, for the first time in many years, a genuine spark of hope began to glow. 48 hours later. The morning began like any other. Emily stood inside the restaurant, a cleaning cloth in her hand, bending down to straighten chairs that had already been neatly arranged. Early sunlight slanted through the glass windows, casting a pale light across the tabletops, which still carried the faint scent of disinfectant. Everything looked normal. Too normal. So normal that Emily wondered whether everything that had happened 2 days earlier had simply been a stress-filled dream that lingered too long. She hadn't told Lily about it. She didn't dare to. Hope, once spoken aloud, felt more fragile than ever. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. Emily froze. She didn't reach for it right away. In that moment, her heart was pounding so fast her hands began to tremble. Part of her wanted to ignore it, because if it was just a telemarketing call, or worse, another notification from the hospital about new expenses, she wasn't sure she had the strength to hear it. But then she took a deep breath and answered. Hello, this is Emily Carter. Miss Carter? The woman's voice on the other end was calm and clear. This is Dr. Reynolds calling from Mount Sinai. Emily had to grip the edge of the table. Yes, this is me. I'm calling to update you on Lily Carter's treatment file. Time seemed to slow. The Whitmore Foundation, the doctor continued, has approved full coverage for your sister's Trikafta treatment. Emily couldn't breathe. 3 years, the doctor went on. 3 years, fully covered, with the option to extend if necessary. We can begin treatment as early as next week. All sound around her disappeared. No clinking glasses, no coffee machine humming. Only one sentence echoed in Emily's mind. 3 years. 3 years. For others, just a span of time. But for Lily, it was an entire life being returned. Miss Carter, are you still there? Emily slid down into the nearest chair. Yes, she whispered. I'm listening. Your sister will receive treatment, the doctor said gently. That's what matters most. The call ended. Emily remained there. Her phone rested on her lap. Her hands covered her face. And then she cried. Not the kind of sobbing cry, but the kind that comes when the body finally allows itself to collapse. She cried from relief, from gratitude, from sleepless nights, from early mornings, from every moment she had asked herself, is any of this effort worth it? Emily called Lily immediately. Emily? Lily's voice came through, weak but familiar. Hey, Emily said, her voice trembling with emotion. We're okay now. There was silence on the other end. What do you mean? You're going to be treated, Emily said, tears spilling again. The new medication. Starting next week. You're going to be okay, Lily. You're going to live. A sob came through the line, then crying. then laughter mixed with tears. The two sisters cried together for nearly 20 minutes in the middle of an ordinary morning that suddenly became the most important day of their lives. But while Emily was still immersed in that miracle, elsewhere in the city, a very different storm was forming. In a spacious penthouse overlooking Central Park, Eleanor Whitmore stood in the living room, her hand clenched tightly around her phone. "What did you do?" she shouted. Daniel Whitmore sat on the sofa, an espresso cup in his hand, his voice frighteningly calm. "I didn't do anything, Mom."
"The foundation did exactly what it exists to do."
$120,000, Eleanor screamed.
"For a waitress!"
Daniel set the cup down on the table. "No," he said. "For a human being." Eleanor turned away, her breathing sharp and uneven. "Do you know what people are saying? That video is everywhere.
I've become a laughingstock across the city."
Daniel stood up. "No, Mom," he said slowly. "You became a mirror."
And for the first time, people didn't look away.
Eleanor turned back to her son. In her eyes, for the first time, there was not only anger but fear. Because perhaps, deep down, she understood that this story had only just begun.
"You humiliated me."
Eleanor Whitmore's voice echoed through the vast penthouse, a space so polished it felt cold. The glass walls overlooking Central Park reflected her image, a woman once accustomed to commanding an entire room with a single look. But now, that gaze was no longer confident. Daniel Whitmore stood a few steps away from his mother. He wasn't crossing his arms. He wasn't leaning on anything. He simply stood upright, as if he had been preparing for this conversation for a long time. "No, Mom," he said. "I didn't humiliate you. I just stopped hiding it." Eleanor let out a hoarse laugh, stripped of its usual confidence.
"Do you have any idea what they're saying out there?" she asked. "In the clubs, in the boards, at the parties where I used to be respected."
Daniel didn't look away. "I know," he replied. "I've seen the videos too." She spun back toward him.
"And you still dare say you didn't humiliate me?"
"You turned me into a joke across New York." Daniel stepped forward. "You did that yourself," he said slowly. "I was just the first person who didn't look away." Eleanor stopped. Her breathing grew heavier.
"You don't understand," she said, her voice dropping. "I spent my entire life building this position. I sacrificed everything for you."
Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment.
"I know," he said.
"But do you remember who you used to be?" Eleanor frowned.
"What are you talking about?"
Daniel looked straight at her. "Dad was a waiter," he said, "just like Emily." The room went silent. "He used to stand in the kitchen," Daniel continued, "behind the counter, carrying plates out to people richer than him. You loved him," he said, "not despite that, but because of it." Eleanor opened her mouth, then closed it again.
"That was different," she said weakly.
"How was it different?" Daniel asked. "Because he was your person? Or because once he became successful, you decided he no longer belonged to people like them?" Eleanor turned away, her hands clenched tight.
"You have no right to judge me," she said. "I lost your father."
"I lost everything." Daniel stepped closer. "You lost Dad," he said softly. "But you didn't lose your compassion.
You let it go."
The words landed like a heavy weight. Eleanor turned back. For the first time, tears appeared in her eyes.
"You don't know what it feels like," she whispered, "to wake up every morning and realize
that the one person who truly saw you is gone. Daniel swallowed. I do, he said. I lost him too. She froze. But I didn't turn that pain into an excuse to hurt others, he continued. And neither should you. Eleanor staggered back and dropped into a nearby chair as if her legs could no longer hold her. I don't know how to live anymore, she said quietly. Without him, I don't know who I am. Daniel knelt in front of his mother. Maybe, he said, gently. It's time for you to find that person again. A long silence filled the room. Outside, the city kept moving. Cars passed, people rushed on. But inside that penthouse, for the first time in many years, Eleanor Whitmore stopped running from herself. That girl, she said, her voice trembling. Emily? Is her sister really that sick? Daniel nodded. 17. Without treatment? She might not live past 25. Eleanor closed her eyes. Your father had a cousin, she said. He had the same disease. He died very young. Daniel said nothing. Why did you help her? Eleanor asked. Because she dared to stand up to me? Daniel thought for a moment. No, he said. Because she dared to protect her dignity, knowing it could cost her everything. Eleanor opened her eyes, and in that moment she no longer saw a young waitress. She saw a part of herself that she had lost. Do you think I can change? Eleanor asked, almost pleading. Daniel took her hand. I don't know, he answered honestly. But I do know one thing. He looked straight at his mother. If you don't try, then everything you've built will amount to nothing but emptiness. Tears rolled down Eleanor's cheeks, and for the first time in a very long while, she didn't wipe them away. 3 weeks had passed since the restaurant in Manhattan became the center of the entire city. 3 weeks, long enough for the videos to spread, long enough for public outrage to cool, and long enough for Eleanor Whitmore, for the first time in many years, to slow down. No more lavish lunch parties, no more packed schedules filled with cold handshakes, no more familiar rush of power when entering a room and watching everyone fall silent. Instead, there were very early mornings in a community kitchen in the Bronx, the smell of hot soup, the clatter of bowls and utensils, and people Eleanor had never once looked directly in the eyes before. She stood behind the counter, wearing a simple shirt and plastic gloves on her hands. No jewelry, no elaborate makeup. No one called her Mrs. Whitmore, just ma'am. And strangely enough, she no longer found that insulting. Her first therapy session kept Eleanor awake all night, not because the therapist said anything harsh, but because of the simplest questions. When did you become this person? And what are you trying to protect with your cruelty? Eleanor didn't have answers right away, but every time she remembered Emily's eyes, not angry, not pleading, just quiet and unflinching, she felt a sharp ache in her chest. One late afternoon, Eleanor stood across the street looking into the restaurant where Emily worked. Not the old restaurant, a different one, more ordinary, less elegant. She stood there for a long time, and then she crossed the street. Emily had just finished her shift. She put on her jacket, adjusted her backpack, and was about to leave when she noticed a woman standing outside. Blue jeans, a simple white shirt, hair tied neatly back. It took Emily a few seconds to recognize her. Mrs. Whitmore? Eleanor gave a slight nod. No polite smile, no pride. Emily, she said, may I have 5 minutes? Emily glanced at her watch. She needed to catch the bus to visit Lily at the hospital. 5 minutes, she replied cautiously. They sat on a bench in a nearby park. The air was quiet. A light breeze moved through the trees. Eleanor looked down at her hands as if unsure where to place them. "I'm not good at apologizing," she said. "And last time, what I said didn't deserve to be called an apology." Emily said nothing. She waited. "I've watched those videos again," Eleanor continued. "More than once. Every time I watch them, I realize something." She looked up, meeting Emily's eyes. "I attacked you, not because you did anything wrong," she said, "but because you reminded me of everything I had lost." Emily paused. "You're young," Eleanor said slowly. "You have purpose. You have something you're willing to sacrifice for others. And instead of admiring that, I chose to diminish you." A tear rolled down her cheek. "I once loved a man who smelled of kitchens and sweat," Eleanor said. "Daniel's father. He taught me that no job is beneath dignity. But when he died, I decided that kind of softness was a mistake." She took a deep breath. "I was wrong." Emily felt her throat tighten. She hadn't expected this honesty. She hadn't expected this vulnerability. "I'm not here to ask for your forgiveness," Eleanor went on. "I'm here to tell the truth. And to say that I'm trying." She spoke about therapy sessions, about the soup kitchen, about the humiliation of having to ask someone to show her how to ladle soup for the first time. "It was humiliating," she said with a sad smile, "but also the most necessary thing I've ever done." Emily looked at the woman in front of her, no longer the woman who threw a plate in a luxury restaurant, just a human being, learning how to be human again. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Emily said gently, "but I believe people can change." Eleanor nodded. "That's enough." She stood up. "You saved your sister," Eleanor said, "but you also saved me by forcing me to look at myself." She walked away without turning back. Emily remained on the bench for a long time. She wasn't sure what she had just experienced, only that it was the strangest and most honest conversation she had ever had. And somewhere, deep inside, a circle was slowly closing. 6 months later. That morning, the New York sky was clear. Soft sunlight fell across the stone steps of the university auditorium, where students gathered in graduation gowns, laughing and celebrating. Emily Carter sat in the front row. She was still the same girl, no glamorous dress, no expensive jewelry, but something had changed. The way she sat with her back straight, the way she looked forward, and the way she believed in herself. When the name Emily Carter was called, she stepped onto the stage to receive her honors degree. Applause filled the hall, not thunderous, but sincere. In the audience, Lily was sitting there. No longer the pale girl who needed oxygen every night. Her complexion was healthier. Her eyes was brighter. She stood up and clapped the hardest. Emily looked down and met her sister's gaze. The two of them smiled. No words were needed. They both understood what they had lived through to reach this moment. At the back of the hall, seated apart from the crowd, was Daniel Whitmore. Beside him sat Eleanor. No one recognized them. No whispers, no camera flashes. Eleanor wore a simple coat, her hands resting quietly on her lap. She wasn't seeking attention. She was simply watching. When the ceremony ended, Emily walked outside with Lily. Amid the dispersing crowd, their eyes met. Daniel nodded. Eleanor offered a small smile. No greeting, no handshake, no reference to the past. And that was the most excellent form of respect. Emily turned away, took Lily's hand, and walked toward the bus stop. No limousine, no luxury car. Just life. A life that had been given another chance. That evening, Emily sat alone in the small room in Queens. The room was the same, the old wooden table, the window overlooks a narrow alley. But the feeling was different. She thought back to that day in the restaurant, to the shattered plate, to the fear, to the moment she decided she would no longer bow her head. Emily realized something straightforward. Her life didn't change because a wealthy man walked in. It changed because she chose to stand up for herself. The help that came afterwards was only the consequence. Some people go their entire lives without ever encountering a miracle because they never believed they deserved one. Dignity is not something you are given. It's something you hold on to, even when it comes at a cost. And sometimes, it only takes one person to stand upright for the whole world to be forced to look at itself. Some stories are not about the rich or the poor. They are about how people treat one another when no one is forcing them to be kind. If this story made you feel something, leave a comment. Perhaps your thoughts will reach someone else. Like if you believe dignity has no price. Share if you think someone needs to hear this story today. And subscribe to Deep Life Tales to continue walking alongside real-life stories, slow, thoughtful, and deeply human. See you in the new following story.